Hey guys, today I want to talk about rear shock cavitation. And basically cavitation is when the suspension fluid inside the rear shock gets contaminated with either air or nitrogen because of some internal failure in the shock. Have you ever gotten on your bike and compressed the suspension and you hear this squishing noise? And you know that not that long ago when you got on the bike and sat down on it and the rear shock compressed, it was fairly silent. Well, what's happening is the rear shock, as I said, has had a malfunction and needs to be fixed. Basically, if you have a DVO shock, you can at home go in and rebuild the shock and get it so that it's working properly and won't have that squishing noise. However, if you don't have a DVO, you have a Fox or you have a RockShox, this isn't something you can do at home. You'll actually need to take the shock off the bike and send it off to someone and let them fix it for you. So today I'm going to go in and provide a little bit more explanation of what cavitation is and why it's bad, why it needs to be fixed, and then using the DVO Topaz shock, I'm going to go in and show you how to eliminate this squishing noise by rebuilding the shock. Okay, let's get into it here. Okay, guys, before we get any further into how to rebuild the DVO Topaz to eliminate the squishing noise, let me just explain what the problem is. And basically, the problem is that shock has been cavitated, or it has cavitation. And basically, this is what cavitation is. It's some internal failure in the shock, most likely a seal or a gasket. And that failure allows air on a DVO shock or nitrogen on a Fox, RockShox, or most other shocks to mix with the suspension fluid in the shock. This mixture foams under movement and heat buildup, and the foaming reduces the suspension fluid viscosity. That is, the suspension fluid gets thicker and doesn't flow as smoothly through the shock. The reduced suspension fluid flow results in the noise, and also the slower moving fluid causes the shock not to dampen. So basically the bottom line is cavitation results in shock noise and poor shock performance. Now over on the right side, I've shown you a good shock where the suspension fluid and the air are separated. And then on the right side, there's a bad shock. And as you can see, the air represented in blue and the suspension fluid in red have mixed. This picture shows suspension fluid that's been drained out of a shock that was not cavitated. And if you notice, the suspension fluid looks golden. There are no bubbles present in the fluid. The fluid's very clear. And in short, the suspension fluid is not mixed with air or nitrogen. This, on the other hand, shows suspension fluid being drained out of a cavitated shock. And notice that the suspension fluid looks white and foamy. And it looks this way because there are many small air or nitrogen bubbles present in the suspension fluid. And the air nitrogen is mixed with the suspension fluid. And this is obviously not good and not what you want. You have shock cavitation in this picture. Now, I'm going to show you what to do to rebuild a DVO Topaz. Like I said, you have to send most of the other shocks off, but you can do pretty easily a home rebuild of a DVO shock, which is one of the many great features of those shocks. And the following pictures and descriptions should be supplemented with the DVO Topaz service manual. On their website, they have service manuals which take you through step by step how to rebuild those shocks. Very easy to follow. They have all the parts they sell online and everything. So supplement what I'm going to say with those steps in that manual. But first you need to remove the shock. And as you can see, this shock has a piggyback on it. And after you remove the shock, take it apart. But all you need to do is take off the air canister. You don't need to detach the piggyback for what I'm going to do. And then drain the suspension fluid out of the shock. Now, as you know, you saw that shock making a lot of noise when it was being compressed. And not unsurprisingly, the suspension fluid shows cavitation. Then you need to get a tool. This is a tool that I made, and this is a tool that allows you to pull the bladder out of the piggyback. And what you do, you screw the tool onto the Schrader valve, and then as I've highlighted in red, before removing the bladder assembly, you need to remove a C-clip from the top. Very important step. And once you remove the C-clip, then you just pull sort of pry, wobble around a little bit, and you'll eventually, as you pull the cap out of the piggyback, you'll pull the bladder out with it. Now, these are pictures that show the major parts of the air chamber and bladder in the piggyback. Note that the bladder will have air on one side and fluid on the other side when it's working properly. If the bladder gets a hole in it, or if the bladder does not seat properly, air from the bladder will mix with the fluid, and that's how you get cavitation. Now, on the far left side, I'm just showing the pieces of the bladder in the piggyback, and down at the bottom, I'm showing the bladder separated from the piggyback and the Schrader valve insert into the bladder. And then on the far right side, I'm showing in this particular case why you have cavitation. In this picture, it shows the end of the bladder, which has been removed from the piggyback. And where I've drawn a red circle around and an arrow to, you'll notice that there's a tear in the end of the bladder. And obviously that tear allowed the fluid and the air to mix, causing the cavitation. Now, this is a new DVO bladder kit, which I'm going to install on the bike. This should eliminate the hole in the bladder, and it should seat tightly on the piggyback, and that will prevent the suspension fluid and air from mixing and eliminate the cavitation. Now, what I'm showing in this process is probably not recommended by DVO, and I'm sure you guys are going to wonder why I'm doing this. And sometimes when I build these shocks or rebuild them, I mess up and I have to go back and take it apart, and you can burn up and just waste a lot of shock fluid. So sometimes I recycle the shock suspension fluid, but to get optimal performance, use new fluid. But like I said, I sometimes reuse the fluid, but I filter it. And in this case, I'm showing how to reuse the suspension fluid. And once again, probably not recommended by anybody, but I do it. And what I do, I catch the fluid in a large bowl as I drain it out of the shock. And then I pour the fluid into a jar with a coffee filter on the top of it to strain out the fluid. And as you can see, this fluid looks very light golden. If it gets really dark golden or dark, I don't, I just put new fluid in. But this fluid, looks relatively new. So I'm just going to reuse it in this for the purposes of this video in the rebuild here. Now, at this point, after you remove the bladder, a lot of the suspension fluid will be out of the shock. But since I'm not using new fluid, I don't have to fully drain the shock. I can just leave some suspension fluid in it. Now, when you leave suspension fluid in it and you've had cavitation, you need to let it sit for probably at least an hour, maybe 2 hours, just so all the bubbles get out of the fluid. But I have the shock also in a vise with a large bowl under it to catch any overflowing fluid. And also the most critical part of the refilling with fluid is to make sure that all the air is out of the head of the shock. And that's the bend from the fluid chamber to the piggyback. It's very, very easy if you're not careful, to have air caught in there. And if you rebuild it and there's air in it, it's gonna, you're rebuilding it cavitated. So, but having the shock in a vise like this allows for better bleeding, and these other photos will show that. But on the far right, if you notice, this is a top view, and you can see that I still have some fluid in that shock, as is evident by the fluid that's still in the piggyback reservoir. Now, to refill the shock, there are three separate phases that I focus on. First, I partially refill the shock with suspension fluid and get all the air out of the bend in the shock, and that's where the shock bends from the piggyback up to the main fluid chamber. And then second, I insert the bladder, and third, I refill the remaining shock fluid or the remaining suspension fluid into the fluid chamber. Now, these are pictures of the first stage of that process, and here I attach a syringe to the shock, and then I push and pull the plunger on the syringe, allowing the piggyback to fill and empty, but I never drain the piggyback dry. What you're doing, you're pushing and pulling fluid, basically pushing it and pulling it out of that bend in the shock. That's where the bubbles are. And if you keep doing this, emptying and filling until there are no more bubbles showing in the piggyback, then you've got it done. And it normally will take you about 15 times, 10 to 15, maybe even 20 times going back and forth to get all the bubbles out. Just go slowly, be patient. Now, over in the far right picture, I'm showing, you can see the bubbles that are in that piggyback. I've just pushed the fluid up out of the syringe into that piggyback, and as you can see, there are three bubbles that came out. And you just want to keep doing this process until you don't see any more bubbles. The second stage of the process is inserting the air bladder, and this is very important to do in the exact sequence they show in the DVO manual. And what I've done is I've just taken the pages out of the DVO manual. It's steps 74, 75, and 76. Step 74, once you get the bladder ready to insert it back in the bike, you need to thread in the valve core and tighten it. Now, it's very, very important to do this step before you do 75 and 76. But once you get the valve core in and tighten it, then you go in and you insert the bladder back in the piggyback. Now, before you put the bladder in the piggyback, you want to have the piggyback about a half to 3/4 full of suspension fluid. And when you install the bladder and push it down into the piggyback, suspension fluid, or they say oil, will drain over the edge. And that allows you to get a good tight seal between that bladder and the piggyback. And then once you get it, you push it down in the bladder. And once you push it down in the bladder, in step 76, you install a bladder retaining clip, a C-clip, and then you take the thread puller and pull the bladder assembly, that Schrader valve, up until the bladder assembly touches on that C-clip. And once you've done that, at this point, there should be no air in that suspension fluid behind the bladder, and the bend in the shock should be completely free of air. The third stage of the process is refilling the fluid chamber. Now, hopefully the fluid chamber is probably, about half to 3/4 full, because, you've been already, using the fluid, moving the fluid around in there. But you take a syringe at this point and fill the syringe about 1/3 full with suspension fluid and attach it to the fill plug. Now, then the syringe and the shock are cycled through the shock's travel until all air bubbles have been removed from the system. And this will normally take between 10 to 15 cycles. But if you see the picture on the left, I'm just showing sort of a top view of where I have the syringe attached to the fill port. And over on the right, I'm showing there's a red arrow by the syringe, so you'll be pushing that syringe and pulling it out. and you'll also be pushing in the shock. If you'll look down, you'll see another red arrow near the right near the vise. So you'll be pushing and pulling on the syringe and pushing and pulling on the shock. And by the way, this isn't an exercise in how strong you are. You want to go slowly, and you want to push it in, pull it out slowly. It also helps to make sure that you have the damper completely open in this process. If you have the damper closed, it's quite hard to pull it and pull it out. So make sure that the damper is fully open. Now, after no more bubbles are coming up from the shock, remove the syringe. And when the syringe is removed, you should see suspension fluid fill up the drain plug hole. If you don't, then you need to put the syringe back on it and keep going through the process until when you take the syringe hose off, there is fluid in that hole. No air, just fluid. And then you reinsert the drain hole plug bolt. And when you stick that bolt in, it should displace fluid so that you know you've got an airtight, there's no air in there when you put that when you put that bolt in. Also, it's important to note you do not need to tighten this bolt too tightly. Just twist it with the hex with your fingers, and that should be tight enough. Then you reassemble the shock, put on the air can, etc. Add air to the shock and to the bladder, has based on the DVO guidance or what you're used to reinserting it to. Then reinstall the shock on the bike, and at that point, the shock should compress without any squishing noise. I hope I've given you guys something to think about, and I'll see you at the top.